Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second day of our two-day knowledge transfer virtual conference. Today, we will have three very busy and informative theme sessions, and we'll finish this afternoon with a closing session at which the winners for the best research presentation will be announced. Before we start this morning, there are just a few points to explain the running of this webinar. There is a separate link for each of the theme sessions, and these are listed in the conference program which you received and are also available on the events page of the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science website. We'll also publish the link for the next session here at the end of every session. All sessions are recorded and will be available on the School of Agriculture and Food Science YouTube channel at UCD Ag Food and on the Teagasc Publications website. For all who are active on social media, please tag at UCD Ag Food and at Teagasc and use the hashtag KTConf 2020. Also, there may be polls undertaken during some of the sessions today, so please participate if you're invited to do so. The posters and abstracts for each of the presentations are available on the Teagasc website, the publication section, and the link will be emailed to all participants. With that said, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Anya Mackin-Walsh, Senior Research Officer at Teagasc Rural Economy and Development Programme, to open and chair this first session of the day. Anya.
Thanks very much, Jim, and welcome to everybody here this morning. The title of this session is Fostering Innovation in Rural Development, and particularly welcome this morning are the 6 presenting contributors to the session, the range of which represents students from both the MAEI and MAIS postgraduate programs. And the range of papers you'll hear today include projects that on one hand are based on students' own tried and tested experiences of advisory work in the field, and they present evidence-based insights to what makes advisory work effective. And on the other hand, then we have papers that are derived from studies of farmers and other ACAS actors about their perspectives, preferences, and so on, that will enhance our understandings of what might work better in the field in terms of advisory work. So just to give you a little bit of an insight to the various presenters. The first presenter is Aoife Ford, who recently completed the MAIS programme. Aoife undertook a participatory multi-actor process to stimulate and support interactive innovation in a rural community. She gives a detailed insight to the step-by-step process involved and her reflections on how it worked in practice. And she also tells us about some impacts of her innovation brokering work on the ground. This morning's second paper is from Lisa O'Toole, again an MAIS student who has completed just her first year. And she sets the scene for advisory and policy promotion of contract cropping arrangements between farmers. And from her research thus far on farmers and advisors, she identifies factors influencing more sustainable contract cropping agreements. Owen Sweetman recently completed the MAIS programme, and he presents this morning's third paper, which is based on research he undertook on the factors influencing tillage students' decisions to diversify and the influence of ACAS actors in this context. Our fourth paper this morning is from Claire O'Keefe, a recently completed MAEI student, and she presents from her very practical, evidence-based experience of the importance of soft skills when it comes to advisors providing good succession advice. Claire then is followed by a presentation from Roisin Murphy. Roisin is a recently completed MAEI student, and she presents her research on young farmers' career motivations and their attachment to place, which, as she would explain, often manifests of love of their land. The final presentation then today is from Jennifer Keegan, again, a MAEI student who has recently completed, and she undertook a systematic literature review to examine the health literacy of farmers. So just to note, to follow up on Jim's housekeeping advice, this morning's session will comprise presentations from each of the 6 contributors in turn. These are pre-video recorded, and then a panel discussion will take place, where questions are welcome using the Q&A button, which is located in the panel on the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled, so please do use the Q&A button, and you can submit a question at any time throughout the session, and we will address those questions, as many as we can, time allowing, at the end of the session. So with that, I'll turn you over to the first presenter, and thank you very much and welcome to you all again.
Good morning, and the first of our presentations on this session, Fostering Innovation in Rural Development, is from Aoife Ford, and Aoife is looking at facilitating rural communities to create enterprise opportunities using a participatory process.
Hello there, and you're very welcome to my presentation today. My name is Aoife Ford, and the title of my study is Facilitating Rural Communities to Create Enterprise Opportunities Using a Participatory Process Developed by SKIN, the Short Food Supply Chain Knowledge and Innovation Network. I suppose just to give a little bit of background to my project, like I said, it was linked to SKIN, the Short Food Supply Chain Knowledge and Innovation Network, an EU Horizon 2020 project. The area which my project focused on was West Kerry, which is based in the Dingle Peninsula, and it was selected as the only SKIN regional node in Ireland. The SKIN regional node of West Kerry was also used as a testbed to co-create tools for impact assessment and evaluation of interactive innovation for Liaison, another EU Horizon 2020 project. So I suppose the aim of my study was to conduct participatory action research while facilitating interactive innovation, to document, analyse and reflect on the participatory process used in this research. I also used a range of tools and techniques from the SKIN multi-actor toolbox, as you can see here, which was developed for stakeholder engagement and innovation brokering. So my project began on the ground in January 2019, and I was very, very new to the West Kerry community. So following on from a number of phone calls with local development organisations and local farming organisations, I had to actually identify what stakeholders needed to be engaged in this project and how I would actually engage them. So an engaging and incentivising plan was developed, as you can see here, and it showed different methods which could be used to engage the different stakeholders identified. The next step is we decided to hold an engagement day, so that it would give the local community in West Kerry the opportunity to come in and to meet me and to find out a little bit more information about the project itself. Following on from the engagement day, we then held a brainstorming day, and this was advertised through the local media, as you can see, and it was also advertised through handing out leaflets in the West Kerry community. So everyone was asked to come in. People sat down in groups of about 5 or 6 people. They were given a flip chart paper and they were given sticky notes and loads of black permanent markers. And they were asked to write down every single idea and vision that they had for West Kerry themselves. On the night, over 200 different ideas were gathered, and they ranged from setting up a seafood co-op to farm walks to exporting crabs. There was a huge range of different ideas. Following on from that, the next thing was to sort these 200 ideas, and we gathered again and we looked at all the different ideas that had been gathered, and we asked participants to identify different themes, and 4 main themes emerged: tourism, renewable energy, food production, heritage culture, archaeology and conservation, and these formed the 4 different working groups. Now, all of the participants were asked to join either 1 or more working groups depending on their interest. And then we asked them to go shopping for ideas. So we hung up the 200 different ideas around the room, and we asked them to go and pick ideas which they thought were relevant and which they wanted to pursue. After the shopping for ideas, they were then asked to create a very, very basic group plan outlining what they wanted to achieve. Following on from that, the next step was to actually identify the actions and resources that they might need. So it's actions that they could take to create their first small steps and resources that they might need to do so. In October 2019, I took the group down to Ballymaloo Cookery School to meet with Tim and Dorina Allen, and they received some fantastic feedback on the day. Each group were asked to give a group presentation outlining their group plans of what they want to achieve and how they were actually going to achieve it. I suppose following on from that then, the next step was to allow the groups to take more control. And we set about brainstorming, tasks that needed to be completed within each group, and different roles that different people could undertake. From January to March 2020, we began the final group workshops, and this was the part where I really began to take a step back from the groups. They began setting their own agendas for each meeting, and they began discussing what they wanted to discuss. And I suppose I facilitated them to do this, but I began to take a step back. I suppose just a number of findings from my project. I've found that PAR is a non-linear process. When you're using participatory action research, there isn't a certain step or a certain recipe that you can follow per se. I also found that the multi-actor toolbox was a guide for PAR rather than a method. Communities need to be facilitated to share their ideas in a creative space where they can be innovative, and I suppose this was a key finding. The rural community within West Kerry, they had an absolute abundance of ideas and visions for West Kerry. And once they were facilitated and they were given that creative space, it was absolutely wonderful what was achieved from that. I suppose power struggles and dynamics which occurred during the process must be handled constructively, and dealing with these issues, it takes careful time, consideration, resources and skill, which I had to develop throughout the process. I suppose just a number of recommendations from this study. There's plenty of opportunities for agricultural extension agents to play the role of facilitators and to implement a bottom-up approach within many communities across Ireland, and to allow low-income farmers to diversify. There's also a role for policymakers at EU level to further support participatory approaches to rural development, because it's a hands-on, bottom-up approach, and it gives local people the control, and it puts them at the centre of the research. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aoife. Our next presentation is from Lisa O'Toole, and Lisa's study is looking at encouraging contract cropping arrangements between farmers.
The title of my study is Developing an Understanding of the Relationships and Methodologies of Contract Cropping Agreements. I am under the supervision of Michael Wallace of UCD and Peter Doolan of Teagasc. Teagasc define contract cropping as an agreement where a tillage farmer enters a contract with a livestock farmer to grow a crop such as maize or fodder beet. To date, very little research has been conducted on the operation of these agreements. The removal of the European milk quotas in 2015 generated new opportunities for the Irish dairy sector. The rapid expansion of the dairy industry has created the need for additional resources such as fodder, access to land and labour. Further to this, the specialisation of agriculture has seen a movement away from mixed crop livestock systems towards monoculture systems of production. As a result, animal feed must be sourced from external resources. Collaborative farming agreements, such as contract cropping agreements, have the potential to address the fodder challenge, especially in the context of increasingly specialised farming systems. This study has 4 research objectives. They are to identify the benefits and limitations of the methodologies used in contract cropping agreements, to identify the key factors required to develop trust between the trading parties, to produce a cost-benefit analysis for various contract cropping agreements, as well as the income potential for different stakeholders, and finally, to devise practical recommendations for the sustainable operation of contract cropping agreements. A mixed methods approach was employed on this study, combining farmer surveys, key informant interviews, farmer interviews, and advisor focus group. The table illustrates what method was used to meet each objective. In relation to the nature and prevalence of these agreements, the farmer survey indicated that 9% of farmers are engaging in a contract cropping agreement. Furthermore, 1/3 of farmers indicated that they had a strong or increasing interest in contract cropping agreements. The survey also revealed that the key factors required to create trust between trading parties were honesty, having a good farming reputation, regular communication, and having complete transparency. The factors required for the successful functioning of a contract cropping agreement were identified as having a predetermined price agreed, knowing of possible changes well in advance, and that decisions are made jointly. Based on the advisor focus group, a number of factors were identified as potentially influencing a farmer's decision to enter a contract cropping agreement. These were the attributes of the agreement between the parties, such as the form of contract, the pricing option, and quality parameters, the nature and function of contract cropping agreements, external factors such as policy implications, weather events, and the presence of an external agent or supports, and finally, the attributes of participating contract cropping parties, such as social factors and the individual farm and farmer characteristics. The findings thus far point to the potential of contract cropping agreements to improve the sustainability of both the tillage and livestock sectors through the measures outlined on screen.
Thanks, Lisa. Next presentation is from Owen Sweetman, and Owen's presentation is a study of the factors influencing tillage students' decisions to diversify into horticultural food production.
Hello, my name is Owen Sweetman. The title of my master's thesis is Factors Influencing Tillage Students' Decision to Diversify into Horticultural Food Production. This thesis was completed under the supervision of UCD's Monica Gorman and Teagasc's Dermot Callahan, Stephen Alexander and Andy Welton. The graphic on the right of this slide illustrates the conceptual framework of this study, which is focused around the theory of planned behaviour. The theory of planned behaviour would suggest that a farmer's decision to diversify is influenced by their attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioural control towards diversification. The perspectives of tillage students were identified as particularly interesting, as they are part of the next generation of farmers and may have a role in the future of the agricultural and horticultural sectors. The tillage sector was identified as the most similar agricultural sector to horticulture, and therefore they were deemed the most likely diversifiers into horticulture. This study focused on learning more about how the pillars of the theory of planned behaviour form a tillage student's willingness to consider horticultural diversification options. It also considers how the ACUS can influence attitudes, subjective norms and perceived behavioural control to facilitate diversification into the horticultural sector. The sample population was 9 Level 5 tillage students from Kildalton Agricultural College, all of whom were Irish, male and between the ages of 18 and 21 years old. A qualitative survey was used which asked students to indicate their level of agreement to a series of statements and also to suggest words they associated with diversification and the tillage and horticultural sectors. Participants were then shown 2 horticultural producer videos to develop their knowledge of the horticultural sector as an exploratory before and after part of the method. Semi-structured phone interviews were conducted with participants to develop deeper understanding of the factors influencing diversification into horticulture. This slide highlights some of the key factors emerging from the survey and interviews that influence students' willingness to diversify into horticulture. Tillage students expressed their discontent with the profits achievable in tillage farming and felt tillage farming is over-reliant on EU subsidies. They were generally open to or had experience with low-risk diversification options within the tillage sector, such as protein crops or willow production. Students had an initial false perception that horticulture is mostly amenity focused and were often unaware that commercial fruit and vegetable production is included in the horticultural sectors. The participants proposed that there are opportunities in the fruit and vegetable sectors, highlighting the high potential profits and land utilisation as drivers towards diversification into the sector. However, the participants generally displayed an adverse attitude towards risk and innovative diversification. Social norms had a very significant influence on students' attitudes and perceived behavioural control towards diversification, innovation and horticulture. Themes surrounding perceived pressure to continue tillage farming traditions and a lack of community support for innovation emerged as major barriers to an environment conducive to innovation. In regard to perceived behavioural control, some participants identified that tillage farms' resources could easily be adapted to field vegetable production. They felt they lacked technical and business skills specific to the horticultural sector, while also highlighting that marketing their produce would be their main concern if they were entering the sector. Participants regularly highlighted that if there was increased information on the opportunities in the horticultural sector, they would be in a better position to evaluate the investment. Currently, a lack of crop financial and technical information, along with very minimal market security, means the risk of the innovation is high. This slide includes some of the proposals that emerged from this study: increasing innovation and diversification modules in agricultural colleges, exposure to horticultural producers, particularly young growers and champions of innovative diversification, will help mitigate social barriers to the horticultural sector, develop more positive attitudes towards innovation in horticulture, and help students feel if they can do it, why can't I? Farm visits, seminars and events can provide advisory actors in the ACAS the chance to collaborate, to share knowledge and to facilitate the removal of attitudinal and normative barriers to innovation and diversification. To reduce uncertainty and immeasurable risk factors when entering the horticultural sector, the ACAS needs to be in a position where they can deliver the required technical, financial and business-related information. Market research is required to assess where further opportunities lie in the horticultural sector. The ACAS should take advantage of the opportunities where market data exists and invest in research and advisory resources to develop technical information in this sector. Without this investment and support, the sector will struggle to mitigate the uncertainties that are limiting its growth in Ireland.
Thank you for watching and listening to this video. I welcome any questions in the panel discussion, or feel free to contact me at the email or phone number on the screen now. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Our next presentation this morning is from Claire O'Keefe, and Claire's study looks at soft skills for succession advice.
My name is Claire O'Keefe. My study was an assessment on the role of Teagasc advisors in farm family succession and inheritance planning. I focus primarily on the soft skills of communication. I chose this research because from my own experience as a succession mediator, there is a lack of know-how within Teagasc to address conversations in succession and inheritance planning, particularly from a soft skills approach. Advisors are not trained nor qualified in addressing difficult conversations. Succession and inheritance may be a highly emotive conversation or a series of conversations. Advisors, especially new advisors, do not have the skills nor competency to support these conversations with their clients and family members. Soft skills include people skills, the ability to interact with others. Communication. Body language accounts for more than 90% of all communication, which includes visual communication, how we look and what we perceive we see when we actually look at people. The spoken language is less than 10% of communication. That's really important when we're facilitating succession cases. Interpersonal and intrapersonal, both of these are interrelated. Interpersonal is how we communicate with other people with respect. Intrapersonal, that's looking after and taking care of oneself, awareness of our own emotions and our own coping skills. Listening to understand. Listening is a soft skill. Listening to understand what the other person is saying. It's different to listening to evaluate a situation. Showing empathy and seeing it from the other person's perspective. Finally, emotional intelligence. Being aware of one's emotions, recognizing your own trigger points, and where you are vulnerable in a situation, how to get, again, supports in these situations, just to support yourself so that you are the best that you can be with your own set of soft skills for succession advice. Hard skills for succession advice are technical skills, know-how, knowledge transfer. They're measurable, they're manageable, they're research focused, they're time scheduled. KPI, key performance indicators. They're what advisors are experts at.
Get to know the farmer and the family members. When possible, include the family in conversations, especially if there's a farm visit. Include the next generation. so they know what's actually happening on the farm. Try to understand the family dynamic and make no assumptions, as one doesn't always know who the boss actually is, nor whom within the next generation might be the next potential successor to that farm.
Soft skills for succession advice. The findings from my own research was one's own background and how one was reared, one's own set of values. That does impact on one's ability to address difficult conversations or courageous conversations as part of succession planning. The lack of awareness in how to deal with many cases meant that advisors actually avoided difficult cases. It's not an innate competency that many people actually have, so training is essential. Currently, there's no soft skill training specifically for succession advice, even in the SECRA model. Experiential learning does develop confidence over time, and that was highlighted right across the findings. Possible solutions to support advisors in addressing necessary, courageous succession conversations include incorporating a module in Year 3 and 4 in undergraduate studies on essential soft skills. Design and deliver a bespoke farm transfer module within the SECRA programme, especially for the benefit of new advisors. In addition, my recommendations include, at regional level, at least to have one advisor with a competency and confidence to support advisors with succession cases, and nationally to have at least one specialist advisor. And finally, to deliver a CPD module, perhaps aligned to the IFTN network, on skills for succession advice. Let this be a standalone module, accessible and available to all in Ireland. Muile buchas le gach duine san ollscoil a cabhraigh liom le gábh lína nuas, agus le mo cóscoileoirí goléir go nairi libh as seo amach.
Thanks, Claire. Our next presentation this morning is from Roisin Murphy, and Roisin's study is a study of the examination of young farmers' attachment to place.
Hello, my name is Roisin Murphy and the title of my thesis is Attachment to Place, Deconstructing the Career Motivations of Young Farmers in Ireland. My thesis supervisor was Dr. Tomás Russell. The connection between people and their land is often an important aspect of farm decision making. The relationship farmers, young and old, have with their land and surroundings influences their land management decisions and the future of their farm. However, how a farmer develops land attachment is still unknown. Studies have shown that a farmer's love of their land is part of their identity and their existence, as they have a duty of care to their land and their animals. Agriculture has played an important role in the lives of many Irish people for generations. The family traditions that have been passed on will have helped shape the agricultural practices used in Ireland today. A farmer's engagement and understanding of their environment can lead to the development of their attachment that is difficult to put into words. Farmers have a deep connection to their land that has been managed and maintained for generations using local and family traditions. Place attachment is a complex concept that has implications for farmers when it comes to career choices and farm family succession. A farmer's attachment to place can be influenced by their memories, their emotions, family traditions and the feeling of belonging, among other things. Each farmer's attachment to land is different and will vary depending on their own personal experiences. Throughout this research, a young farmer will refer to an active farmer under the age of 40 who is currently studying or has obtained the required agricultural education. In order to deconstruct and examine the career motivations of young farmers, the research focused on the attitudes towards place attachment and connection to land. It looked at the factors that contribute to young farmers' choice to farm at home. The research also looked at the influences and rationale behind young farmers' occupation selection and whether attachment to place had an impact on these decisions that were made by young farmers. The main body of research investigated young farmers' attachment or lack of attachment to their farm and their land. The research showed whether young generations of farmers have a deep attachment and love of their land that is also associated with the older generation of farmers. The completion of the research will give us a better understanding into the intentions of young farmers in Ireland today. It will allow us to consider place attachment as a factor that influences career choice and the future of young farmers in Ireland. In order to address the research questions, this study intends to determine to what extent attachment to place has an influence on the young farmer's career decisions, to develop an understanding into the career motivations of young farmers, and also to identify the factors that contribute to place attachment and a sense of place in young farmers. A qualitative study was carried out in Ireland between June and August of 2020. Primary data was collected using the biographic narrative interpretive method. This is an unstructured style of interviewing. This style is considered when significant depth is required in the subject area. It allows for the greater representation of the participants' real-life circumstances and experiences that a researcher would struggle to achieve using other methods of data collection. The interview is split into two sections. A single question aimed at inducing narrative was asked first, and the participant is able to speak freely and express their experiences. The researcher takes notes and does not interrupt or prompt the participant. The second stage then focuses on what the participant has just said, and only topics that were raised in part 1 can be discussed. 8 eligible candidates, 6 male and 2 female, were interviewed, and they represented the south, east and west of Ireland. Due to COVID-19 and the government restrictions, 3 interviews were carried out in person and 5 were conducted over the phone. The research showed that attachment to place influences a young farmer's career decisions. The young farmers interviewed all identified as farmers, and this attachment is associated with who they are. They are attracted to farming at home and carrying on their family tradition. The rich history of farming encourages their passion and love for the farm. This influences these young farmers to choose a career that facilitates farming at home. They have an unexplainable love for their land, and farming elsewhere would be very different and difficult for them. One young farmer has no history of farming in his family, but says given the opportunity he would love for it to be carried on and to become a tradition. He would also love to own his own land, as he rents the land that he farms on and does not have the same connection as someone whose parents and grandparents farmed the land before them. The sense of belonging to a particular place influences all aspects of a person's life, which can be sometimes unknowns to them. Farming was a part of all the participants' lives, and this has impacted their decision to farm at home in the first place. The farmers interviewed mentioned that their decision to farm at home was made because they loved farming, it is a way of life, and they couldn't see themselves doing anything else. That is why a career in farming suits them, as they enjoy farming at home, and a career in agriculture would give them the opportunity to continue to do what they love and to develop their farm. How these farmers are attached to their land is all based on their own life experiences and their own circumstances. It is very much an individual concept that cannot be grouped together. Place attachment is multifunctional and is determined by a person's own experiences and own life circumstances. Attachment to place arises from an individual's behaviour and attitude towards their farm and their farming experience, and it is different for everyone. The research suggests that childhood memories, emotions, knowledge of the land, family traditions and length of residency all have a bearing on the degree of place attachment a young farmer has to their land. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Roisin. Our final presentation in this morning's first session is from Jennifer Keegan. And Jennifer's study is examining young farmer attitudes and behaviour when it comes to exercise and health, a systematic review.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Keegan and I'm here to introduce my thesis. My thesis title was to examine the health literacy status of farmers by conducting a systematic review. My supervisor was Dr. Monica Corman in UCD. Research background. I was interested in this topic due to changes in agricultural practices and how technology has actually reduced the workload for farmers. Farmer health, so I was interested in looking into the aspects of how to keep healthy and maintain a healthy lifestyle for farmers. And then educational status, are we equipping our farmers with the correct skills and knowledge to maintain a healthy lifestyle? Formulating my research question, I used the PICO tool, which looks at the problem, intervention, comparison and outcome. So in my case, the problem was the health challenges facing farmers today. The intervention was health education and how that could impact or improve the situation. comparison was using no educational interventions, and the outcome was the type of study. So I chose a systematic review. The first objective was to establish a baseline, or to measure the level of health literacy status among our farmers. And 2 was to examine what could be done to improve the situation or to encourage these health enhancing behaviours among the farming community. So the next step was to select the databases I was going to use. There's a wide range of databases out there, so I performed a wide search on Google Scholar and UCD OneSearch, and I kept coming across these 3 databases, so I felt that these were the most appropriate databases to use in this review. The next step was to determine my search strategy. I wanted to look at the following 3 themes: health literacy, farmers and agriculture. I used mesh terms across the 3 databases, so the mesh term for each of those was health literacy, farmers and agriculture. So this was to ensure that I was pulling all the information that used these 3 terms across the 3 databases. I also looked at the eligibility criteria, so what papers I was going to include in the research. So I only used research articles that were full research articles, that they focused on the farmer, they defined health literacy, and then that were actually from an agricultural context. If they didn't meet any of these criteria, they were not included in the review. So once each search was conducted on the database, I downloaded the group onto EndNote. EndNote is an application used to organise references. And once each search was completed, I saved them on the EndNote application, and I was able to review all the papers retrieved. I also predetermined a quality assessment criteria. This is another criteria that the papers have to meet in order to be included in the review. So this was rating the methodology, approach, the design, and also the outcome of them papers. The initial search identified 20 research records, and after searching the reference list or similar article option on each database, a further 8 records were obtained. Results obtained in the initial search were correlated in EndNote for each individual database, and 3 groups were amalgamated together. Following a search of duplicated records, 8 records were identified and removed, which resulted in 20 remaining records. The year of publication ranged from 2009 to the year 2020. This systematic review yielded results from research articles from around the world, and research was obtained from 10 different countries. Upon assessment of resulting articles from the 3 databases, several key terms were determined and identified. The following themes were used to characterise the research articles in the review: health literacy, farmer health practices, role of education and training, farmer health and well-being. The predetermined eligibility criteria was applied to all 20 research papers. Research papers that met all 3 inclusion criteria were fully included in the review. The criteria included that the papers had to be focused or defined health literacy of farmers, 2, to focus on farmers or agricultural workers, 3, interventions that were measured or behavioural changes. The 3 articles displayed on the slide at the minute were fully included in the review. The next step was to apply my quality assessment criteria. The quality assessment of the studies is an important aspect of the review, as it provides feedback on the overall strength of the data retrieved in the studies. The quality assessment acts as an additional buffer for information to ensure the most suited studies are fully included in the review. This systematic review highlighted several common health issues and concerns affecting farmers across the world. The varied methodological approach in each paper retrieved provided a broad range of research perspectives, with some articles not mentioning the concept of health literacy directly, but elements of the concept were taken into account to result in the increase of knowledge and skills of the participants. The studies reported in the literature review demonstrated the important role education plays in the level of health literacy of a population. It was also noted in the research data how important the educational approach is, so specifically designing and tailoring training programs to provide an effective approach of transferring essential health education to participants. This systematic review provides an overview of the relevant research relating to the status of health literacy of farmers, and can be used as a starting point to increase the health literacy of farmers to improve and promote health-enhancing behaviours through tailored programmes and training. The findings also showed that specific interventions that use a collaborative approach led for more empowering results on changes in behaviour of participants. Overall, the research articles in this review presented strong evidence highlighting the need for policy action to address health literacy in the farming sector. The adoption of a multi-dimensional approach has the capacity to build health literacy. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So we might begin with a question for the first presenter, Aoife Ford, who presented her interesting study on mobilising interactive innovation on the ground. And I might just begin, Aoife, with a question that also takes the interest of one of our attendees through the Q&A function there. You mentioned, Aoife, that a community needs to be given a creative space, which involves facilitating the community, but also involves you as the practitioner standing back to give local people control. Can you tell us a little bit about how and if the community did take control in your case, and more importantly, how you as a practitioner identified any signs of them taking such control?
Thanks, Anya. Well, I suppose to start off with, the group that I worked with, they were self-nominated. So they had expressed an interest in getting involved, before I came along. And I think throughout the process, they were very, very committed, and they were very, very interested in what they were doing. And I suppose as I began to step away towards the end, back last November, we actually set about deciding tasks and roles that everyone would take. And we brainstormed different tasks and then grouped together and created roles that each individual could take. And I suppose it put a structure in place for when I had left, that they knew exactly how to continue on, that everyone had their role, and everyone knew what was required of them. And I really think that they really took that on wholeheartedly. I suppose throughout the process, I kept a reflective diary, which was really, really important, because when you went back, you could look over and see exactly, you could tell everything as it had happened. And I suppose on reading that reflective diary back when I was writing my thesis, you could really see that there was points where I had noted that people were taking ownership. Maybe I might have got a phone call and someone would have said, oh, I'm talking to this person and this person is looking to get involved. And I suppose being able to actually look back and reflect on that, it was very, very helpful in being able to say, look, that these have taken control. And the community really, really did take control fully. And when I left back in March, they had a plan for the future. And since then, they're actually, after getting funded, two groups who are involved in my project, the local IFA and the Dingle Innovation Hub, they're actually after getting funded for another EU project at Pluto. So they have plans to continue on what they have started.
Thanks very much, Aoife. And it's a related question that came in through the Q&A. Any feel for the profile of those who became involved and those who did not?
To be honest with you, there was actually a huge range of people that were involved, because it was, I suppose, the starting group. It kind of started with the IFA. When it ended up, it wasn't just farmers. There was people from, all walks of life that were involved in the project, people who lived on the peninsula. There was farmers, there was people involved in arts and the culture, there was teachers. So I couldn't say that, no, it was specifically for one group of people. It was really the entire community coming together. It wasn't just the farming community, it was the entire community coming together.
Thanks very much, Aoife. And I know from your own work that a very significant characteristic of the community mobilisation was the number of farmers, and particularly dry stock farmers who became involved. So interesting there in general when it comes to the profile of people becoming involved in these rural development projects. Thank you, Aoife. We've about 4 minutes per panelist, so forgive me if we must move on rather swiftly to Lisa next. Lisa, you identified in your findings how factors such as honesty, transparency, farmers' reputations, and good communication are important to farmers when it comes to sustainable contract cropping agreements, so entering into them and sustaining them. But what, from your perspective, Lisa, are the top implications from these findings for advisory services and advisory practice? Please, Lisa, thank you.
Thanks, Anya. Well, I suppose the factors you mentioned, such as honesty and good communication, these were identified by farmers as key factors required to create trust. So I suppose in terms of advisory services, They create positive social networks for farmers through discussion groups, seminars and events. So this in turn fosters communication between farmers, which may result in the emergence of trust. And then in terms of findings from the focus group, I suppose one of the key finding was that there are many different contract attributes that may influence a farmer's decision to enter an agreement. So there is a role there for advisors to act as a facilitator between farmers to ensure that each attribute is looked at, that to ensure that the needs and expectations of each farmer within the agreement are met. I mean, they're not off-the-shelf agreements. Customized planning is required. So I think there's a role there for the advisor to oversee that planning.
Thanks, Lisa. Some very good pointers there, and particularly interesting the discussion group context that you can use for fostering these trustful relationships. Thank you. Now, there is a question there in relation to the economic profitability. Any evidence thus far from contract cropping arrangements in Ireland, but I don't believe that was within the scope of your study, Lisa.
No.
Able to provide a reference to such evidence, maybe at some point through a link. So we might move on to the next question then, which is to Owen. And thank you, Owen. You included a nice piece of music there in your presentation. But you also mentioned how social norms are important in farmers' dispositions towards diversification. So their preferences towards diversification or lack thereof. And despite acknowledgement of poor profits, farmers could feel themselves under pressure to continue with traditional modes of farming. So considering these findings relating to social norms, Owen, can you identify any implications for the ACAS? But in particular, can you identify any promising collaborations between ACAS actors in trying to address or challenge those existing social norms? Thank you, Owen.
Thanks, Anya. There's probably several parts to that question. I think overall, the ACAS has to foster an environment that facilitates innovative diversification. So as you mentioned, social norms was a major factor that influenced students' perception of how they could diversify into horticulture. So I think one of the ideas or one of the pointers that the ACAS could do was to foster that social norm in colleges that was the students kind of didn't perceive the colleges have to try to foster innovative and diversification modules, and this would kind of help students to see other opportunities outside of their own area. So I think that colleges and then as well in the advisory side of things, the ACAS can maybe use field events and seminars to try to normalize innovation and maybe to bring advisors, farmers, students to visit other horticultural opportunities or horticultural farms to try to normalize innovative diversification. So when you say collaborations, I think one of the factors that influence students' perceptions of how they could diversify into horticulture was they felt that marketing and the information and the knowledge that they had just wasn't there. So I think that Teagasc can maybe work with Board BIA and other information development agencies that can develop the required information to reduce uncertainty and risk, so that students and potential innovators can diversify into this sector. I think as well, the tillage students perceived that in tillage they're well used to incremental diversification options, and we need to promote innovative and radical diversification options. So horticulture is probably considered more of a radical diversification option, and that's due to the risk that it holds, and that the risk is influenced by the lack of information and data that's out there. So I think to generate the data, there has to be an investment in the horticulture investment in developing this information and distilling it to students and to farmers, and hopefully to promote the sector.
Thanks, Owen. Some very clear pointers there for the very important role of agricultural education. And just a practical question, I'll ask you to answer this quite quickly, but we'll move on, please, Owen. How important do you think is the element of financial security risk in the attitudes of tillage students towards diversification? Thank you for that question from the audience. So how important was financial security in how they made their decisions to diversify?
I think it was quite important. Students mentioned that, if the figures that are, the potential figures and profits that are available in horticulture were put beside the tillage profits that the potential profits that are available in tillage, that would influence. So some students had felt that, if there's money in horticulture, we'd go into it. But I think the risk that was, the lack of information and risk around horticultural opportunities, just made it a very uncertain area, so that it did drive their decision.
Thank you very much, Owen. Now we'll move on to Claire O'Keefe's presentation on succession and the role of advisory services in that context. And Claire, you spoke in your findings about advisors' own backgrounds and how their own experiences influence their approaches to providing advice about succession. And can you give us some of your views in relation to the importance of advisors' reflective practice? I know that's part of your modules in UCD in this context. So the importance of reflective practice for advisors, and particularly considering that many experienced advisors have very long-standing familiarity and good relationships with their client families. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Anya. I interviewed 15 advisors, young advisors, long-term serving advisors, regional managers, specialists, heads of divisions, including the eminent Dr. Tom Kelly. And I did ask on reflective practice in all of those interviews. The young advisors only had experience from their own homes or their grandparents' homes or the experience that they brought with them. And they did use that as the base from where they were coming from. But all of the longer term serving advisors, reflective practice was part of their work. They used different terminology, like, well, thinking back, I would think about it on the way home, or I would discuss it with a colleague if I needed to. The terminology may not have been what they actually used, but it was part of their work routine. And you mentioned, secondly, on familiarity with clients. Long-term serving advisors have very good relationships with their clients. It's very respectful, but it generally is with one client and not the entire client's family. Where there's a new energy presenting, where the energy of maybe the potential successor might be different to that of their client whom they have a relationship with for many, many years, especially if communication in that farm family home isn't great, the advisor will protect his relationship with his client, and they will point them in the right direction for where to get further supports. But where there's good communication within that farm family, the long-term serving advisors have no difficulty with opening up the topic of succession and embracing all members of the family. So it depended on the advisor's ability as well as how communication is within the farm family.
Thanks very much, Claire, and you're highlighting there the importance of taking a whole farm family approach indeed. And just as a follow-up question, we'll take it from our international participant, our colleague from ZLTO in the Netherlands. He asks you, Claire, in your own view, obviously soft skills are very important, not only in this area of advisory services, but in many others. But would you, what do you think is the balance between the importance of the hard skills, so focusing on the finances, and then as distinct from the soft skills? So what would you say is the balance in turn? He asks you, would you put a percentage on it? How important would it be? 50% soft skills, 50% hard skills, or what would you just? I know that this hasn't been quantified, but in your own view, in your own experience, Claire.
Well, ideally, if students could be introduced to soft skills when they're still in their undergraduate years, to be aware that there are soft skills required with the hard skills. Not everybody has the awareness or the ability to go down the soft skill route. And some people are really, really good at empathizing, and they'll be 100% in that area, and they might be out of sync. They may not be balanced with equally with the hard skill set. I don't have, that was not part of my research. I didn't do a quantitative analysis on hard versus soft skills. But what did come up was that there needs to be an awareness of the soft skills, especially not only in succession communication, but there might be financial issues, there might be health issues that need to be discussed, there can be addiction issues in farm families, and for the advisor to be able to acknowledge that these are challenges and they do influence the hard skills that are being discussed on the family farm as well. So they're not totally separate, they are interlinked.
Thanks, Claire. And just from his view from Dutch practice, he says that when people are incentivized, or the impetus for entering into discussions of succession might be in relation to things like inheritance tax and so on, he'd say 70% to begin the discussion, but it ends up, and 30% soft skills, but when the actual agreements come into place, it's heavy, there's the reverse. It's really 70% about how people get on and the soft skills that are needed to make these arrangements in the long term sustainable. So thank you, Claire. We'll just move on to the next presenter, Roisin Murphy. So very interesting presentation, as were all of them, Roisin. You mentioned the policy definition of active farmer in your presentation, and that is something that's been very topical in recent years. Just from your own research on farmers about their sense of place, how do you think this policy definition of active farmer corresponds with the farmer's own definitions of what an active farmer might be?
Thanks, Anya. So I think the definition I used was a young farmer as an active farmer under the age of 40 who has obtained or is studying, has an agricultural degree. So I think an active farmer, like all the farmers that I had dealings with, are all involved, like fully involved with their farm at home. They're involved in the day-to-day running of the farm and involved in the decision-making process. So I think for them to develop and this attachment to the place, attachment to their land, like they're surrounded by the farm and they have the daily experience. So it's not just it's just something that they want to be involved in. They're currently involved, they're always involved, they want to be involved. So I think it's pretty much like they are active, they're taking part in everything that's going on in the farm, and this is what's building up their sense and their level of attachment to their land.
Thanks, Jennifer. And just a related question. You mentioned interviewing both male and female participants in your study. Can you give any comment in relation to any gender differentiations that you would have noticed in your data?
Yeah, so from my study, I do think that gender had no bearing on the level of attachment that male and females have on to their land. Both male and female were very much attached to their land. There was one farmer who he openly said that if he could go and get more land somewhere else and farm somewhere else, he would. But that was just based on his own experience, because his parents or grandparents weren't farmers, so he has no direct connection. He rented all his land. So it just so happened that was a male, whereas the two females that I interviewed, they have a long family history of farming, and they plan to farm at their own home. So for my study, there was no bearing, gender had no bearing on the level of attachment. Thanks,
Roisin. And just a question here from the audience. It might be a little bit tricky to, but it's an interesting comment, if not a question. From your research, would you say that place attachment is something that is necessarily good, or could it cause someone to keep going with something that isn't worth keeping? Thank you. And a related question: how do Irish farmers' place attachment compare with the situation internationally? And we know that in Europe that there's a very high proportion of farms are held in family ownership. But is it a support to or an impediment to resilience? So their sense of tenacity and dedication to the farm, to its long-term survival. Do you have any comment on that, Roisin, just the link between place attachment or love of their land, as you described it, and the survival of the farm in the long term?
I do think, well, from my experience, the farmers that I dealt with, their love of their land is really helping them and helping them to improve their farm, and their diversification on their farm, and it's really leading to innovation and change, and their parents are open to the younger farmers' opinions, and it's positive effect on that sort. I do think in relation to Europe, and they have a lot of family farms, that I do think it is a positive attribute to Irish farming, and that it is going to attachment to land. It's not, if things get tough, it's not just, oh, we'll get rid of it. They want to continue on, and they want it to survive, and they want to continue on farming, and they want it to be a tradition within the family.
Thank you very much, Roisin. And we just might move on to questions then finally. The last presentation from Jennifer. So Jennifer, your research identified the importance of education, and in particular tailored education, to address particular gaps when it comes to farmers' health literacy. Can you identify which ACAS actors might form important partnerships? Because you describe a type of collaborative, multidimensional approach that you recommend in addressing these gaps. Any partnerships between any particular ACAS actors you think might bring those approaches to fruition?
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, I suppose just looking at the educational status, so I suppose peer-to-peer learning is quite important, how the farmers perceive the health and well-being of themselves and then also their peers as well. So I suppose that's an important actor. So, and then also just even from an ag advisor, when they move on and how they're actually speaking to farmers about health and well-being, that continual professional development of health and well-being and how it's advertised and promoted within the industry. I suppose I did look at obviously throughout the life stage of a farmer, their health, their well-being is obviously going to be, that's why I was saying about a tailored approach. It's not a one cap fits all. And I suppose the best starting point is our students in both ag colleges and universities, because not all ag students that are doing the Green Start are going home to farm. It's also at our universities, so our level 8 students, our level 7 students are going back to farm. So even including health literacy modules within the course would also be a very handy starting block for farmers going home to farm. And then even when they're advisors, if they're going in that route, that they can actually go out and speak to the farmer. And just even, I suppose the health status is, our health literacy is probably how they use the information and how they actually take that health information and use it to their situation. And I suppose the literacy skills is the reading, the writing, and I suppose a lot of information out there, like there's so much data out there, but it's actually how the farmer can interpret and use that data is the important aspect of my study. I suppose I was just interested in this part or this study because, as we all know, technology, we can drive a tractor without even sitting in it now. And I suppose just even the physical aspect of farming has reduced the physical labour on farm. And I know labour is an issue on farm as well, but just even providing the information with to the farmer to actually how they can get their 60 minutes of active exercise a day, and just providing that information, how they actually can use the data that's out there, because there's so much information about health. I suppose even just through online classes, fitness classes, as we've seen through lockdown. I suppose just how we can use that information was the main part of my study, really.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And in the question and answer section from the audience, there are 3 related questions. And from your data, I'm not sure whether, in fact, you'll be able to answer them, but we'll ask them anyway. The first relates to any differentiation between gender, according to gender, and also according to age in the review you conducted.
I suppose the young farmers, I can speak from my own experience. I can find it very easy to get out in the evening and, join the sports teams, the local GA or whatever. So I suppose from a young farmer aspect, we can, there is certain farmers that will go out and do their exercise, or, they'll understand, they're able to look up YouTube videos on even how to cook food or whatever. So I suppose technology on our side of things obviously will improve our health, but then there's also the attitude towards health and well-being. I suppose, as we know, there's a high rate of suicide among our farming community, and just even how, sometimes we just don't know how to ask for help. Are we given the right amount of information out there? Are they able to understand and use the information that's out there? I suppose there's so much data, as I was saying earlier, even when I was doing my study, just trying to even hone in on the Irish context. I suppose there's so many different agricultural practices across the world and different land type, agricultural enterprises. So it's just, I suppose, what I was focusing really was if there was an issue with a farmer, how they actually access that information. Were they able to understand? It was just going back to basics. Like, was the reading and writing skills up to standard? Like, because we all know, like, even if you look back on the box of a medicine or whatever, it's just so complicated. So I suppose trying to pare back and just clear communication across the board really was looking for.
That's great, Jennifer. And there were also some comments there in relation to differences between sectors, agricultural sectors, and also how Ireland compares internationally. So you might just, in the last minute, you might make one brief comment in relation to that. Do you have any insight to how Ireland compares internationally when it comes to health literacy?
I suppose on an international basis, there isn't that much research out there from an Irish context. I know there's health initiatives currently being out there run by the Irish industry, but I suppose that's where the collaborative approach comes into. There might be a certain cohort that doesn't know that these health initiatives are happening. So I suppose that's where it comes back to the collaborative approach, that we're all in it together and just using the ACAS system, that everyone is aware of what research is out there. And I suppose that's where I was hoping that the systematic review was looking at that research and where them gaps are. And that's where I came up with the gaps in knowledge was definitely at educational level, especially in the colleges, and how we don't even have the health literacy modules included in that as well. So from an Irish context, I suppose there is initiatives out there. It's about linking them initiatives together and how we're going to combat the health issues that are coming down the road or currently in the farming sector.
Thank you, Jennifer. So with that, that brings us to the end of our session with a couple of seconds to go. I would like to thank and congratulate all of the 6 contributing speakers this morning, also my co-chair, Professor Jim Kinsella, and the organisers overall. A reminder that presentations are available, videoed presentations are available on the School of Agriculture and Food Science website, and abstracts and posters are available on the Teagasc website under 2020 publications. So with that, thank you very much.